Hi, Matt Madigan coming to you on day 29 of my 2022 40-day fast. Over these 40 days, I'm answering 40 questions around long-term fasting in 40 days. At the beginning of this fast, I really felt God challenged me, encouraged me to, instead of doing a fast where I didn't let anyone know, that I was to create 40 videos over 40 days to really answer some questions around long-term fasting. So here we are at day 29. I really pray that God has been blessing you and speaking to you and doing some great things in your life over this time. So today's question is, does fasting sharpen my listening skills? Well, maybe not your listening skills to other people. Sometimes I find myself quite zoned out while I'm fasting. But one thing I've noticed in my life is it does sharpen my listening skills to the Holy Spirit, to what God's saying. It's an interesting dynamic that it seems like as the distraction of food is set aside, something within my spirit just comes alive, and I find it a lot easier to hear God. So you might ask yourself, is there any sort of precedent in the Bible for this? And that's a really good question. We find ourselves looking at the book of Acts today. The disciples come out of their time with Jesus, their experience with Jesus, and they are making new patterns, I guess, for the way church life should be. In Acts 13 verse 2, we see something really interesting happen. The leaders of the Antioch church have come together, the teachers and the prophets have come together, and they're seeking God. And this is what happens in Acts 13 verse 2. It says, while they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work for which I have called them. Interesting that this happens in the context of prayer and worship and fasting. And it's really interesting that the word fasting is used here. So we see this pattern where the leadership are obviously doing some sort of regular fasting, and in the midst of that, the Holy Spirit speaks. We don't want to miss how important this event is in church history as well. Up until this point, most of the mission had been towards Jews in the known world where the Jewish people lived. And then as the Holy Spirit speaks to them and says, set aside these two to go into mission, we see a dramatic shift in the focus of the mission from this point onwards, and into the Gentile world goes Paul and Barnabas. So we don't want to miss the idea that they hear God in this incredibly transformative way to go into all the world. So do we see fasting again in Acts? We do. And we see in Acts 14:23, they are fasting again, and particularly around the idea of wanting to hear God and set aside leadership for church. So Acts 14:23 says this, Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord in whom they had put their trust. Interesting that Paul and Barnabas, who had been in the gathering in Acts 13, when they're thinking about leadership for those next places and setting people aside, that fasting would be right in the midst of that. It became, I guess, a model we see for Paul and Barnabas in hearing God about who should be the leader and then setting them apart for that ministry. So how does that work for us? Well, I think it works for us in a multitude of ways. I know of so many people who, when they really need to hear God, they really need to get direction from the Holy Spirit, they will go and spend a few days praying and fasting. There's something about setting aside the distraction of food that helps us to listen and respond really clearly to the Holy Spirit. I know that some of the most transformative and powerful things I've heard from the Holy Spirit have definitely happened during times of prayer and fasting. So I want to encourage you today that I think fasting really does sharpen our ability to hear the Holy Spirit. Hopefully you will experience that as well. If you find this video helpful, can I encourage you to like and share it on your socials? Jump onto YouTube. Like and share, that'll be fantastic, helpful. And I pray on day 29 today that you wouldn't be just counting down towards day 40, but you'd be experiencing all that the Holy Spirit wants to do in your life today, and you'd just be rejoicing in that. So God bless, see you on day 30.